And no, I have no slides, so you can turn that on. Good. Now, the website for XMLPrague gives, or rather used to give before they deleted the old homepage and put the live video that several people have brought up in the course of people's talks, a number of possible topics for this year's conference. I won't read you the list in full because, partly because it sounds a lot like the list of topics we've heard addressed over the course of the last few days. This doesn't always happen for conferences, by the way. It's striking that they got papers on so many of the topics they listed. But mostly I won't list it because almost all of the topics in the list have been overshadowed for me by the first one. XML as new lingua franca for the web. Why did it never happen? That's a thought-provoking question, and I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about it recently. Now, maybe it's just that I've been here in Prague this week, but I have been struck thinking about the question these last couple of days by the apparent parallels between our situation and some of the situations described in a book published 25 years ago by someone many of you will have heard of, a specialist originally in the theater of the absurd, who later became known for some other things as well, a man by the name of Václav Havel, later president of Czechoslovakia, probably the first absurdist playwright ever to become a head of state. At least a state recognized by other people. In the 1980s, Havel was a fairly prominent dissident, and he engaged in a sort of long-distance interview with a journalist who was located in West Germany and was not allowed to travel into Czechoslovakia, just as Havel was not allowed at that point to travel to West Germany. So neither of the participants in the interview were able to travel to see each other. So they communicated partly by typewritten pages, but Havel said, no, that doesn't sound like a conversation. So they started communicating by tape and then transcribing and editing. And at one point in this long-distance interview, published in English under the title Disturbing the Peace, Havel says, we're going through a common crisis. Reflecting on that crisis should be the starting point for every attempt to think through a better alternative. Where does the cause of this crisis lie? And he speculates that it lies in a conflict, he says, between an impersonal, anonymous, irresponsible and uncontrollable juggernaut of power, the power of mega machinery, and the elemental and original interests of the human being as a concrete individual. There seem to be several possible ways to apply that description to our situation. I'll go into some of them as we go. But back to the question with which I started. Why did it never happen? Now, the formulation of the question in the web page is more careful than some forms of that question that I have encountered. In particular, it does not assume that having XML become the lingua franca of the web was in fact an explicit goal of the original XML working group, or even it also manages to avoid assuming that that group had a single consistent set of goals. There were a lot of people involved, different people had different goals, and I doubt that all of the goals held by even any one individual were necessarily logically consistent. But whether the group as a group had as an explicit goal the spread of XML in such a way as would take over the web or not, there's no question that a lot of us would have welcomed that. We would have thought it would be a fine thing if XML took over the web, and maybe some of us did think explicitly that that would happen. I think, for example, of the discussion that led to what is now known as Draconian error handling. Now, the time this came up, the working group had already discussed syntax, and the language that was being designed had shaped up as being one in which there was no tag omission, to use the SGML term, explicit start tags and end tags for everything, and so on. And so we knew that it would be highly redundant, and therefore that it would be extremely well suited to error detection and error recovery. And some of us were rather surprised that the browser representatives, in particular Tim Bray then representing Netscape and Jean-Paul Lee representing Microsoft, insisted that we not only not prescribe error recovery, but that we do our best to forbid it. And we said, the rest of us, why? You're crazy. The whole point of having so much redundancy is to make it easier. And they said, no, please. Look at the HTML browsers, at the parsers in the HTML browsers. You can't see the source code. We can, but you can see the size of the executable growing with each release, and most of that is not new functionality. Most of that is preserving hopelessly convoluted parsing code and replicating every bug that the other guy makes. And we said, well, you don't have to perform error recovery. It's okay. We're not going to require it. And they said, you don't understand. And eventually, one of us said, yeah, you're right. I don't understand. So explain. And they said, either of the two major browsers can successfully refrain from error recovery only as long as we both refrain from error recovery. But the moment he makes a mistake, I have to replicate it. The moment he fails to detect an error and reject a page, I have to immediately accept that page. And as the moment that happens, it's a race to the bottom, and you will be in the same situation we're in with HTML. Now, I sometimes wonder, did that mean they were hoping that the browser would eventually be able to get rid of the quirks mode, what we now call the quirks mode parser? Maybe. If they actually thought that, then in retrospect that seems like a very naive assumption. It now appears that no web software is ever allowed to throw away junky code. You're stuck maintaining it forever. So it's possible, of course, that they knew that already, and that this was just a desperate cry of, it's too late for us, but save yourselves. And sure enough, XML parsers do not carry nearly that amount of error recovery cruft. And it is not necessary to devote a lot of time from intelligent people to try to figure out a common story about what is and is not accepted by a conforming XML parser, the way it has proven in the HTML effort, HTML5 effort. All the more important then that in our work on XML, we support good software development methods, and we make it possible to provide good development environments. And I have to thank George Bina for his two talks that relate to this topic. First, on the definition of XML projects, which is an essential step forward in making better XML development environments, and in his paper on data content management, which is development environment for content, as it were. Both very important. And there are others that we'll come to. Now, of course, the idea of wide, visible uptake of XML on the web may have also been naive for different reasons. Why would we have thought that it would be a great thing for XML to propagate widely? Was it because we wanted to be popular? Was it that we wanted to be in on a big thing? I'm sure both of those were true to some extent. Was it because we wanted a lot more people to be working on tools so that we could use those tools without so much work of our own? Surely, at least that was a conscious goal of mine. But partly, it was, I think, because many on the working group regarded descriptive markup as we knew it from HTML and as we hoped to preserve it in XML as an important tool for sharing information between applications and between organizations and individuals, and indeed a tool for thinking about information and thinking about the world. Sharing first. HTML and XML were, in a sense, intended as a kind of Esperanto. Provide a common language, allowing for mutual communication, not necessarily everybody's or every application's first language, but one you use to communicate, to share. It has a sort of hopeful feeling, like the name Esperanto, and perhaps it's a bit naive. Has document interchange ever fully worked? If you're interested in that topic, by the way, I'll mention a sister conference, Balisage, which this year is having a one-day pre-conference symposium precisely on the question of whether document interchange, as we have pursued it for the last few decades, let's not go into details about numbers here, the last few decades, whether it's fact or fiction. And in practice, Esperanto has not become the lingua franca of international communication. Today, all of us here in Prague are speaking the same language, but it's not Esperanto, and it's not Czech, and it's not German, it's English. And in practice, some users have reacted to XML as if it's not really at all like Esperanto, but like an entirely different language. Again, Havel. Some of you who are familiar with Havel will remember one of his early plays called The Memorandum, which is all about language invention. It's about a large organization, actually it's faceless bureaucracy, of course, like many organizations in Havel's work, a large faceless bureaucracy where a memo comes down from on high requiring that all inter-office communications be formulated in a new language called, can I pronounce this right? PTDP. PTDP is an artificial language intended to cure the deficiency of natural languages. First of all, it has much higher redundancy, so that it is much easier to detect and correct errors. And it takes 27 characters to say yes or no, I think, and so on. You can imagine for yourself how much fun it has. He has with properties of redundancy in natural languages. And PTDP also eliminates ambiguity. It is a purely neutral language. In many ways, it's like first-order predicate calculus. It has no ambiguity, it has no metaphor, it has no similes, it has no humor, has no irony. And in the play, of course, humans do ultimately start, first they resist it because it's a completely inhuman language, but ultimately, in the last scene, they do start talking it naturally. And of course, the moment they start using it as a natural means of communication, they introduce ambiguity, puns, and jokes. And at that point, you realize that the needs of humanity have completely defeated the intentions of the language designers. And many web developers seem to have reacted to XML as if it were not an Esperanto for computers, but a PTDP. And what's worse, a PTDP which more successfully than the one in the play resists becoming a real language fit for use by human beings. Uche Oguchi showed us one constructive way to deal with this. If there is a large class of developers, as Uche showed us, who really don't want to see XML, but have to deal with XML because, as Uche said, that's where the data sources are, then it can help to make the world a better place if, as Uche has done, we provide a way to deal with XML data sources in terms that are friendlier to those developers, friendlier, more humane in a real sense. John Snelson, similarly, reminded us about some of the reasons that some of us got interested in XML in the first place. Declarativity can and does help us to do smart and useful things, including optimization. So much for sharing as a motivation. But beyond sharing, even before you come to the moment of sharing, one of the big attractions of descriptive markup for some people, including me, was precisely that because it does not rely on a vendor to provide the semantics of the file format, it allows and requires you as the user of descriptive markup to specify that language. It puts you in the position of Adam and Eve looking at the world, dividing it up, naming things, deciding what are the important properties of anything. So there's a huge feeling of freedom and autonomy associated with the correct use of descriptive markup. And it helps defend the autonomy of the information provider and information consumer against the sometimes hostile or apparently hostile software vendor. So no offense to those of you who identify primarily as developers, but as a user, I definitely often have the sense that my interests and the interests of the developers of the software I'm using are not always the same. To quote Havel again, it's important that human life not be reduced to stereotypes of production and consumption, but that it be open to all possibilities. It's important that people not be a herd manipulated and standardized by the choice of consumer goods and consumer television culture, whether this culture is offered by three competing giant capitalist networks or by a single giant non-competitive socialist network. And in this context, I want to rewrite the earlier quotation as we're going through an app development maintenance crisis. Where does the cause of this crisis lie? In a conflict between an impersonal and uncontrollable juggernaut of power, the power of the browser vendors and HTML5, and the elemental and original interests of the XML user as a concrete individual. Now, of course, it's tempting to make all sorts of dramatic gestures about the relation of XML and HTML, but as Havel also says, sober perseverance is more effective than enthusiastic emotions, which are all too capable of being transferred with little difficulty to something different every day. And so I thank Norm Walsh for being willing, for being grown up enough to sit in a room talking with people whose opinions about important things are so much different from his own. I doubt that that was a comfortable operation. It certainly wouldn't have been comfortable for me. The decibel level might also have been higher if I had been in the room. But I think it's important that we try to coexist constructively with people with other interests, that we try to cultivate an openness and a pluralism. And in the same sense, I'm happy to have seen John Cowan's poster on micro-XML, James Clark's attempt to reconcile some of the conflicting demands of different communities, even though, as Daniela Florescu has pointed out to me, it doesn't satisfy every community, including her. I'm also grateful to Florent Georges for talking about a tool for building XML sites, servlet, and also its use to build a site for XML tools, CSAN. Both of them things I'm glad to have come to Prague to learn about. And then there's the ongoing work on standardization that we saw described in the various standards updates. Standardization I think of as an important part of the self-governance of this or any community. And then there was a whole long series of talks about coexistence with JSON, or for the most part, about looking at and working with JSON through XML lenses. Alain Couture's work about JSON, exposing JSON as XML in X forms, Jason Hunter on doing the same thing in MarkLogic Server, albeit without so much of an XML lens. The paper by Fisher et al. On the translation of Sparkle and SQL into XQuery fits into this pattern as well. And Eric Fenderfith's paper should also be mentioned here, because if we're going to be serious about using XML on the web, then we are going to have to be serious about things like hostile users, adversarial users, and code injection attacks. That's, again, part of fundamental software engineering, part of making the world a better place. But perhaps the most dramatic set of papers here relate again to something Havel says in the long distance interview. As I understand it, spiritual renewal, or as I once called it, existential revolution, is not something that one day will drop out of heaven into our laps or be ushered in by a new Messiah. It is a task that confronts us all, every moment of our existence. We all can and must do something about it, and we can do it here and now. No one else can do it for us, and therefore we can't wait for anyone else. I could point to a great deal of evidence to show that this is already going on. And here, I think the outstanding examples are the series of talks we've heard, Michael Kay on XSL2 in the browser, Peter Fisher and others on XQuery in the browser, Alexei Skoroymykins and Henry Thompson on XSD validation in the browser, Alex Malowski on streaming asynchronous XML retrieval in the browser. There's a pattern in those titles, you notice? We all can and must do something about the problems we face. No one else can do it for us. We do not need to wait, and we should not wait for the browser makers to solve these problems for us. Or look at it a different way, the best defense is a good offense. Let's put XML in the browser whether they want it there or not. And in another vein, there's always work to do, quite independently of other communities and what they will or won't do or want us or don't want us to do. The systematic development of useful XML vocabularies and applications is always worth attention. So I was happy to hear the paper from Ladislav Lotka on the development of a vocabulary to support a very complex and very important application area, and the papers by Murata Sensei and Tony Graham on EPUB 3, which is another complex application area, and Murata Sensei's work on EPUB for manga, which is also complex, although in a rather different way. Like the existential revolution predicted by Havel, the revolution we're looking for, whether you think of it as a software revolution or an information revolution or an autonomy revolution, it is not something that one day will drop out of heaven into our laps or be ushered in by a new Messiah. It is a task that confronts us all. We all can and must do something about it, and we can do it here and now. The best evidence that this is going on here and now in our community of XML and the web are the talks at this conference and at other conferences and your participation, both these last 2 days and in the weeks and years to come. It is important that information management and the web not be reduced to stereotypes of production and consumption or to stereotypes of any kind. They need to remain open to individual human and organizational needs, including both our own needs as developers and our needs as producers and consumers of human culture. Let us go now and make that happen.